If that voice had been in your left ear, you'd have to see Dan professionally.
There you go. Hi, all. Welcome back to the last panel discussion of the day. I think we saved the best for last. I think this is going to be a great conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about where does the future lie for digital biomarkers and digital measurements. So I know we've welcomed a few new people to the panel, and I wanted to Dan, Peter, we've introduced you, so I'm going to give you a pass on the introduction again, unless you really want to. And I'm going to go ahead and allow everyone to briefly introduce themselves before we get started. I'm going to start at the bottom of my screen. Liam, would you like to introduce yourself?
For sure. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Winterlight Labs. We make technology to quantify speech-based digital biomarkers in neurology and psychiatry. Thank you.
Thank you. Josh.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Josh Langford. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Active Insights, where we specialize in the measurement of lifestyle and behavior using wearables.
Wonderful. Katie.
Thanks, Carrie. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate Lyden. I'm the Chief Science Officer at VivoSense. And for those of you unfamiliar with VivoSense, we describe ourselves as a science and analytics company where we essentially function as a core lab for wearable and remote monitoring technologies in clinical research and healthcare applications. So super excited to be here.
Wonderful. And Shobal.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm Shobal Data. I head the R&D Digital Strategy Group at Takeda, where we spend a lot of our time on sort of a related continuum of technologies. One is obviously digital measurements. The other space is decentralized trials and digital health products.
Wonderful. And Dan and Peter, you've introduced yourself prior, so unless you really want to, I think we're good in that space. You're also both very well known. So I'm really excited about this session. Again, similar to before, don't feel that you need me to pick on you, but if it gets quiet, I will pick on you. I don't think I'll have to with this group. And if there's specific questions that you want this crew to answer, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm hoping this will be a great general discussion of where your thoughts are with regards to digital biomarkers and measurements. And I'm going to start it out with, while we want to go to the future, what are some of the limitations that we currently have with digital biomarkers? And that'll set us up well for where we want to go with it. So what are some of the current limitations? And I'll sit down, and I don't want to take all 20 minutes, but I think there'll be some thoughts and opinions. What are some of our current hiccups, if you will? Don't all speak at once.
I could take a crack at this. So one of the challenges that we see is our technology can extract about 550 characteristics from speech and language. And there's a sort of trade-off where we can focus on accuracy or explainability and interpretability. And so that's one of the challenges that we have right now, is working with our partners to kind of figure out, are we working with clinicians who might favor interpretability? Are we working with ML scientists who might favor accuracy? So that's something that we find challenging.
Mine is pretty simple, which is that almost all of the work in this space is being done, both training and testing on concurrent criterion validation against existing incredibly crappy instruments. So when I read that someone has created some complex technological solution that gets the same outcome as the PHQ-9, I have two thoughts. One is, cool, but the PHQ-9 takes about 10 seconds and is free and really easy to do on paper and digitally. And second, the PHQ-9 was created by Pfizer to sell Zoloft. And maybe that shouldn't be what we treat as the gold standard for what depression is, because the point of the PHQ-9 was to get people diagnosed with anxiety disorders to become diagnosed with depressive disorders so they could get Zoloft prescriptions.
So I can pile on to what Dan just said, because I would say that, in my opinion, the biggest limitation is the lack of validity evidence to support these measures, both from a clinical and analytical perspective. And I couldn't agree more with the idea of using core reference standards, right? Like, we're not proving anything if we show that this real world measure of physical function correlates well with the in-clinic 6-minute walk test. I want to know, is it clinically relevant for my patient population? Is it related to survival or hospitalization or some other hard clinical outcome? So I think, moving forward, we really need to build the validity evidence base for all of these measures.
Any other thoughts?
I'd also add, I mean, apart from the validity, which is where we are most of the time right now, another one that comes in the way is also practicality, right? And so if you think about, forget about digital biomarkers, just about biomarkers, right? Where do you get your signal from? Where do you collect your sample from? We've kind of worked that out, but to actually validate some of these in a clinical research setting, the technologies that need to come together, it's not easy. And that also stands in the way. It's a long road to get to a validated marker, and this doesn't help either.
Yeah. I think actually interesting when you start thinking about traditional biomarkers where you know where your sample's coming from, very large. I think very often in the digital space, sometimes we don't actually know where our signal is coming from. There is still a problem, and I think Liam referred to this earlier in passing, that there's a problem about sorting out the information from the data very often, and digital sensors are capable of giving us a huge amount of ones and zeros, but trying to figure out actually what our sample is within that, I think, is still a challenge that we need to take on. And understanding where you start to filter this huge amount of data to be able to make some sense of it, where you're rejecting just the noise or the unwanted signal and not actually removing the signal, I think is still a very big challenge for us.
Yeah. So Carrie, I think that I'm going to summarize what everybody said, because we're actually recognizing that there are, at least on two axes, sort of two sides to these. One I'm going to say one great divide is the signal processing versus machine learning divide. And there's a I think Liam pointed that out nicely. And this persists. And in medicine, it becomes very interesting to sort of say, look, I'm looking at this kind of set of global variables, but I don't quite know what they are. And they're this goes to a systems analysis of the world. There's an infinite number of properties that define any system, but there's a limited number of observables, and many of those observables are useful or not. But they're often what you can observe. So, I mean, I'll just sort of say one of the problems with machine learning view is it's like, well, it's unbiased. Well, it's always biased because you chose to measure something, and that's often technical bias. But the flip side is on the sort of signal processing side, which is more physiological and therefore more appealing to most of us who are more traditional in our biophysical view of the world. You sort of say, well, I can only measure what I can measure, and I'm worried about its fidelity. So this is an area that I think is a challenge, and the answer is it's actually somewhere in between, and we haven't figured out that hybrid. So it's a dichotomous, it's Socratically dichotomous, but the fact of the matter is the truth lies flexibly in the middle, and it's a dynamic process. And then this other one is I think the area of how do we understand? I mean, really, what the question is we're asking. Half the time we end up just arguing about what is it I want to measure. So I'm going to use the example because it always strikes me, glucose measurement. It's a great, should I put somebody on insulin, or do they have diabetes or not? And we used to measure fasting glucoses, where we tried to constrain, we tried to, starve yourself for 12 hours, and then I know what your physiological state is. Now I'm going to do a fasting glucose. That's what the doctor did. You come in, you did that in the morning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And everybody cheated around that because you'd starve yourself for a few days and try to think you're smart. You try to, especially if you're a doctor and you're worried about, having diabetes or having somebody tell you you have diabetes, which is the worst thing can happen, is then you have to actually measure things. You have to inject yourself with stuff, and nobody wants to do that because no doctor trusts the healthcare system. So you sort of do all those things. And then, of course, comes the hemoglobin, sort of the hemoglobin test that allows you to say how's somebody looking. And then, of course, everybody shifts. Somebody mentioned the Hawthorne effect a while ago. Everybody shifts to say, over 3 weeks, I'll starve myself, and therefore I'll drive my A1C down. But the fact of the matter is now doctors are looking at A1Cs and they're saying, well, A1C, what does it really mean? And it's a better picture than fasting glucose for defining diabetes, but should I act on it or not? The truth of the matter is the best measures we have are still limited by the fact that we don't understand the medicine we're doing. And this goes back to the fundamental question of what is a disease? When is it operant? When does it matter? And our precision, and this is one of the questions that you're coming to, our precision and sensitivity brings this into very close focus. And without knowing the underlying question about disease and health, this is as old a discussion as you get in this field. And if we don't engage that and resolve it, we're in trouble. And that's the future. The future right now is philosophical. And then we've got to apply our tools. So, welcome to fact science. This is like physics of the 1890s, and it's it's metaphysics if you want to go back to Camus. I mean, we're not free from this just because we have fancy iPhones.
No, we're not. And I'll even take it one further, understanding the medicine, coming from a pharm tox background, we're still figuring out the conditions. I love it when someone tells me that I've got, I'll go back to the one I'm most familiar with. I've got atopic dermatitis. I gave a talk recently. I said, so you do, huh? What age are you? Where are you at? It's really complicated. It can present differently. There's different based on race, age, et cetera. There's no one condition. It's also very ubiquitous, and our treatments are treated as such as well. There can be multiple downstream effects and multiple interactions. I think in the last conversation you just said, with the geriatric, and it goes beyond that. Drug-drug interactions, body interactions, molecular interactions. Anyway, that's another whole discussion another day. So where do we think this is actually going to go? I mean, we're getting, and I know I'm going off script a little, so I'm just curious. We talked about the limitations. Where are we going with it? Where do you think we're going to go in 5-10 years? So, we're still, and Dan and Peter, you brought this up in the last session, we're still talking wearables and sensors. And Peter, you brought up IoT and other types of things. Where do you think this is actually going to go in the future as we bring in all of this data? And are we going to start being able to dissect it? Are there going to be new types of technology that we can use that won't depend on me wearing a watch or a insole or something on my person?
I would start to answer that question not with the tech.
Okay.
Because partly because it would be hypocritical of me to start with the tech, because I've been yelling at people for we're pushing a decade now. What's the question you're trying to answer?
Yeah.
Not what's the technology you want to include.
You got it.
To my mind, and this actually goes back to what Peter pointed out before, which is that we often conflate clinical use and individual patient benefit with clinical trial use and sort of, let's say, epidemiological benefit. The convergence there, and where we have to be headed, is that these sorts of measurements enable us to identify novel clinical states that predict known clinical states. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the entire game as far as I'm concerned. In clinical medicine, if we can predict a future clinical state, we treat and we prevent that future clinical state. It's why blood pressure is meaningful. In clinical trials, if we have identified a necessary but insufficient path toward a known clinical state, and we can target that in our clinical trials because it's earlier, because it's likely more frequent than the predicted clinical state, we can do shorter trials and we can have more power with fewer patients. Right? That's the convergence point. And any other target than that, I think, is just, this is now, I'm going to make the statement that I haven't really thought through. Well, I haven't thought through most of the statements, but that anything else we describe as a target can actually be just another way of stating that. We're identifying novel clinical states that predict known clinical states.
And in that context, sorry, please, you go.
So since Dan postulated, sorry, Dan, you shouldn't have done this, with me sitting here. Since Dan, you postulated something that you haven't completely thought through, let me ask you a question. So do you mean by novel clinical states? So, and I'm going to be very systems driven here. So, do you mean measuring the same state, but with different set of properties? I mean, this is traditional thermodynamics, right? I want to measure the internal energy of a system. I can measure its heat, or I can measure a variety of other things. I have a number of ways I can get at that. Sometimes I can't measure something directly, so I do it indirectly. Is that what you mean when you say novel state? Or do you actually mean that there are pre-states? So in your micro-canonical sort of analysis of the dynamic of getting to one state, you're saying there are other states that if we measured them differently, what do you mean there? Because I think this is where this technology could be helpful. This technology helps merge phenomenology to statistics, and I use that in the thermodynamics sense. Phenomenological thermodynamics is diffusion coefficient. Statistical mechanical thermodynamics is the actual Einstein Smoluchowski probabilities of the particles. They get you to the same place, but the Einstein Smoluchowski is much better if you can compute it, if you can do it. Which do you mean? Because I think you're onto something here.
So I was using state more to represent the sort of holistic condition of the being. But I think you're right that we need to consider state as more from the measurement property of the thing we're measuring, and I don't know the answer to your question, partly because you've now exceeded my physics knowledge by probably.
I was saying I was going to give you credit because I'm going to have to do some research after this.
I'm sorry.
But no,
Okay.
but as far as I can follow, you're onto something, which is that what does it mean to be predictive of a future state, and that the probabilistic model there becomes incredibly relevant. But again, to my point from the previous panel, we're generally okay with saying hypertension predicts kidney injury, therefore we should reduce hypertension without just on the Bayesians, right? Without having to go much deeper into what that state truly represents. Now we obviously would do better too, and not to call hypertension a unitary entity, but it works to reduce death to call it a unitary entity. So there's like a functional endpoint here.
Yeah, but to your discussion yesterday where you talked about hypertension with you, Carrie,
Yep.
there was a discussion. I mean, look, hypertension for me, I mean, it looks like I'm probably the oldest guy here. For me, hypertension used to be systolic over 145 and diastolic over 85, and then it became 140 over 80. Today it's 120 over 70, and we're medicating people that we never used to medicate because we've redefined pre-hypertension as a state that actually has risk tied to dementia and tied to kidney disease and tied to the like. So I mean, Dan, that's why what you're saying is critical, and it implies, and what we don't know is we don't know excursions. Do the white coat excursions matter? I mean, how do you how do you map these things? So it's a mapping issue, and this is what we need to work on. These are the mathematics we need to work on.
There are two really interesting points about that point about hypertension, is that we're having that discussion without having to think about the units of measurement. We're accepting that we're going to be talking about millimeters of mercury, and we've got very good at accepting that. And we don't try to think of some fundamental thing that millimeters of mercury mean in a medical sense. And there's a level of maturity there within the science that allows us to do that. And we're not there yet. I mean, and the fight that Kate and I spend a lot of time working with accelerometry data, trying to move people just to talk about acceleration, millig's, G's of acceleration. When we start to express things in that term, then we can make progress forward. And we're only just beginning to do that. And I think the other thing that's very interesting, it brings up this question about the difference between state and this sort of time series problem that we might face as a data scientist. But as individuals living in the real world, we live through space and time. We don't exhibit a state at any one time that we recognize, and we move between lots of micro different states through that. And that's what makes that question about why hypertension is so difficult to measure. So there is a slight paradigm shift, I think, when we start thinking about continuous measurement as well, or what we might believe is continuous measurement, that changes the way that we think about this stuff. If we want to stick with the mass space, we move from the Z space into the Laplace space. We move into a continuous phenomenon, and that then allows us to model dynamic systems in a way that we've never done before. And you see this going back to the earlier examples in blood glucose. When you start to model those, we begin to realize how horribly complicated they are. And hence measurement starts to mean something different again.
Yeah, and I'm struck, exactly well stated. This goes back a little bit. So we are still trapped a little bit in Dan's caution. I mean, everybody wants to start with technology because it's cool. I mean, I'm gonna shift my background. I mean, there's my Star Trek collection. And I mean, over there is actually mathematics and biophysics and neurology, which is much harder than Star Trek. You know, unless you're William Shatner and you get to fly into space and sort of marvel at things. The problem, I think the problem we have is really being focused here, and understanding that we need to solve the fundamental problems before we get enamored with the technology being able to measure them. The technology is, again, a trap. We're trapped. We always were trapped in technology because it's the shiny object or the bright flashing LED. And the rigor, the boring stuff, is solving those damn time dependent equations, which are, you know, no one wants to do that, because anytime you do DT, it's really hard.
Well, that's what we're here to discuss, are the hard questions.
Yeah.
It's never simple. If it was simple, we'd be done and we'd be all good.
Yeah.
So with that said, I think I know they ask about cross-industry collaboration. I'd also argue there needs to be cross-academic collaboration in this space to continue to push this forward, because I think we can continue to utilize the industry as a way to test things. But I think the academic questions are still something we need to continue to have to build the science behind, go back to the endpoints of the questions and understand that. I hope you all concur with that. So as we go to the future, I want to know, and this has been a hot topic now too, what are your thoughts on the idea of using, expanding our learning in the digital space to use this as digital therapeutics, using the digital health technology and biomarkers as really as a therapeutic as we move forward? Because that's a big topic of discussion in a lot of different areas now.
We in developing Nightwear, which is a digital therapeutic for nightmares and PTSD, dodged the digital measurement problem entirely.
Okay.
By never making any claims about the measurement itself. So that the way that this device works is it measures excursions in movement and heart rate. And there's an ML algorithm that detects the rate of change of these that seem to correlate with nightmares. But it's very hard to assess sleep phenomena because you don't know when someone's having a nightmare until they wake up and tell you they had a nightmare, at which point you don't really know when that happened or what happened exactly.
Correct.
But rather than make a claim about the ability to detect nightmares, we've looked at sleep quality as an outcome based on intervening when the algorithm thought it had identified. It's hard not to anthropomorphize these algorithms, but when the algorithm thought it had identified a nightmare, and by intervening at that point, we improve sleep quality. So we, rather than have to address the hard problem of what the hell are we actually measuring, and why do nightmares look this way, or how do we validate that we've actually detected a nightmare, we just intervened, and it worked.
Okay.
So is that common, Dan, or is that rare? I mean, I think that's the question, right? So that's
I'm not
the phenomenologic versus the statistical mechanics model. I mean, if it works, you can do it, but in some cases it doesn't work. So is it generalizable?
I haven't seen it generalized, and it's hard to think of many other conditions where what the Apple Watch is capable of doing would be symptomatically beneficial. Right? This was a really nice niche sniper shot at something where mechanistically it worked.
It's great to see.
Yeah.
Others' thoughts, the idea of using some of these digital tools and or thought processes and their digital therapeutics?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So I think to caveat this, I am not, digital therapeutics is not my area of expertise, but I think one of the learnings that has been repeated over and over again today and yesterday and throughout, the discussions of digital health is putting the patient at the center of these measurements. And I think with digital therapeutics, that won't be more true. We can't expect to be seamlessly integrated into a patient's real world without considering things like how frequently they want to be bothered, what do they want to be bothered with, those sorts of things. I think that we really need to take a systematic approach to putting the patient at the center of designing these digital therapeutics. And in the world of public health research, this is closely related to what is called just-in-time adaptive interventions, which are designed to provide the right type amount of support at the right time by, adapting to an individual's both internal and external state. And so I think that, one of the key principles, I think, for getting digital therapeutics really to be uptaken by the public is putting the patient at the center of their design.
Couldn't agree more.
And just to add to that,
please.
we work with paratherapeutics, and one of the points that Corey McCann, the CEO, made about using Winterlight was that effectively they wanted to be able to titrate their medications or like the modules that they present to the patient in either real time or sort of near real time. So instead of going to see a psychiatrist every 6 weeks and then sort of titrating, the goal is to be able to do this in a much shorter time frame, lower burden to the patient. They don't have to go in and see a psychiatrist. And so I think there is a real opportunity to make these medications much more effective when you can start to tune them day by day as opposed to in 6-week increments. The other thing too is I think with some of these medications, you might not see an impact until 8 or 9 weeks, like as is the case with antidepressants. And I think there's hope as well that with digital biomarkers, they could be more sensitive and you might be able to see impact in a shorter time frame, which could encourage people to continue to use these medications or these digital therapeutics.
A pre-state.
Yeah, predictive. Yeah, wouldn't that be great? Well, I know we're running, as I say, we're running out of time. So I think I have it being done. Let me see, make sure I get my right schedule. Sorry, there's too many schedules in front of me. No, we still have time. Keep going. Peter.
Yeah. So two things. So Liam has just made an argument for the benefit of digital measurement, which I'm going to say tends to be my alignment. I mean, what I'm very interested in what Dan's talked about is the success of a phenomenological approach, which I think we should keep in mind is often the case in biology because we don't understand the mechanisms. My preference is what Liam's talking about is that we understand the biophysics and be mechanistically inclined, even though we may have to live in a phenomenological world. But I want to make a point about what Kate's talking about and patient centricity, especially when we talk about measurements, what matters to a patient, it's a very good touchstone. When we get into the digital therapeutic space, it's very different. And I'm going to go to history here. 100 years ago, almost precisely 100 years ago, the healthcare world was filled with this new thing called pharmacology. We moved away from leeches to potions. And potions were, of course, patent medicines. The real excitement about what does the patient want was patent medicines. And what did patent medicines largely contain? Cocaine and opiates. Coca-Cola was a good patent medicine, and almost all of your Dr. Holland's, various snake oils, which is why we call them snake oils.
7-Up had lithium.
And lithium, yeah. So lithium, opiates, and cocaine. So I mean, dopamine, epinephrine, and sodium channels at some point. I don't know what the hell lithium does anyway.
Yeah, nobody does.
But the fact of the matter is the risk here, and I think this is a caution for us in this business. The risk of digital therapeutics is there's a lot of things you can do that patients will tell you they want because it makes them feel better. But there's a trap there because patients often don't know what's good for them. And we're all patients. So there's no us versus them in this. But there is a moral imperative. And I think we need to be careful where digital therapeutics doesn't become a snake oil. And does not become a patent medicine. That's why we have the FDA today. And for all the problems we have the FDA, that's why we have it. So that's the caution. I mean, as I'm listening, I just think I kind of agree. I like everybody else. I have my Star Trek things over there because I like to have the sick bay. I'd like to have a tricorder. There's a lot of things I'd like to have, but there are traps, and we know them because we've fallen in them in the days of chemistry as the magic elixir versus now a digital magic elixir, but they're the same thing.
Yeah, I think we can see some of the future in the failures that there have been over the last 15 or 20 years in behavior change interventions using digital technologies. Yeah. They always work for some people. They never work for enough people to have achieved significance ever. And again and again, when we're involved, and I'm not a specialist in that area, and part of the reason. But again and again, the inclusion of healthcare professionals within the loop, I think, is really important. And I was talking a little bit earlier about, you know, these dynamic systems, and what we're saying is when we're going to use a digital biomarker to create the intervention or tailor the intervention as part of a digital therapy, what we're doing there is we're closing the loop, and how we do that becomes really, really, really important. And there, it's the measurement which dominates the signal ultimately, and making sure that there's a healthcare professional in there to ensure that signal is being applied correctly, seems to be something that comes out from the behavioral interventions as something that's most likely to give success.
Do we see therapeutics really the end goal of where we're going with this? Because we have digital measurements, and at least to me, a therapeutic that is purely digital in nature, the addressable space for that just seems to be very small. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do with digital measures outside of that, but I wonder why we're so focused on that. There's a lot of attention in that space for sure.
I mean, ultimately, I think it goes back to, if it's another great treatment, is it something they can capitalize on personally? But it's a great topic right now, and I don't disagree. Other thoughts?
I'm going to hijack what Peter's about to say.
I
Not even nothing. I'm getting this.
I could see his thought processes. Yep, go Dan.
You know, why are digital and pharmacotherapeutics in different buckets necessarily? Because of course, you know, in the system Peter started with, which is one that we've described fairly well, but still don't really understand how continuous blood glucose affects people in the long run. Continuous other things leading to precision dosing, localized dosing, temporal dosing rate, all of the things that we are starting to see emerge in the artificial pancreas world. There's no reason to think that, I mean, currently most pharmacotherapy treats our body like it's a bag of chemicals, and we're throwing another chemical in and mixing it around. And that can't possibly be the future of pharmacotherapy.
Yeah. I mean, and so Dan does, since he hijacked the thought.
Now you have to expand on it.
And I'll extend it a little bit. You know, it's correct. I mean, and neurology is the better example of this. I mean, people who do livers and people who do, you know, hearts are. To a neurologist, a heart is a very simple thing, right? So it's a complex 4-chambered thing, but it's got some interesting response stimulus elements to it. But largely, you can largely pharmacologically treat a heart without getting into a lot of trouble. You can't do that to a brain. Brains are in fact very much defined by their local environments. So that's sort of where Dan is the next logical piece of this. So I would think digital therapeutics today is very coarse. This idea that your only entrance in is behavior. But if you were to ask me what's the best digital therapeutic we have, I would say cardiac defibrillators. They are hanging on every wall of every building, at least in the first world. I mean, you know, somebody has a biological maladaptive behavior, which turns out to have an electrical signal that you can pick up with a couple of paddles, and the paddles do an algorithm and hit at the right time and start the heart beating. That's a digital therapeutic by definition. That is a digital therapeutic. If I can build an implantable one, that's now an autonomous digital therapeutic. That's where we are. We're talking about this in epilepsy. We're talking about the artificial pancreas. These are digital therapeutics. So when you combine space-time in a small way in the biological construct of anatomy, I think this is what people forget. Anatomy is a defining aspect of biology. Compartmentalization is how nature solves this problem of what do I do with general physical principles and general chemical principles. Digital therapeutics aimed in that direction, we're not there yet, but then I think it becomes the stuff of Matrix. It becomes the stuff of science fiction right now, but that probably has great value.
And going back to the technology point, I mean, this is some of the work that we're doing, putting wearables alongside implantables, how you get technologies to work together to exchange information. That's when it starts. That's when technology gets interesting.
Yep.
So, for example, we're instrumenting with wearables people with implanted devices, they don't want to get inappropriate shocks, but they do want to get a shock when it is the right time. But one of our problems with that is that because of the battery life of an implantable device, you don't want to be wasting a lot of energy sending data up from that thing. So what we're beginning to learn is that we can use a wearable device to identify the changes in behavior that mean that I need to get some data from that implanted device pretty soon because I can see the behavior has changed. Now, I don't know the causalities about that. I don't know whether the behavior change is causing a change in the heart or the heart is causing it, but it doesn't matter because it gives me enough information to say, actually, it's worth the battery in that implanted device putting some effort out and sending the data because I now know that I can make a better prediction. I mean, rolling the conversation back around to the beginning, because I can be predictive from that, but I can only do that with new data if I want to update that prediction. And so when we start to be able to interface technologies together, exchange information autonomously, that's where I think that digital therapeutics gets quite interesting.
So I think you're also speaking to this world of interoperability right now, right? Because it's not a single device situation. You have multiple things that play over here that need to talk to each other.
Yeah, and I think that this conversation also goes back to the last session with Peter and Dan talking about measuring context, right? So the future of digital health and where are we going from here? It's not going to be these single measures taken at a point in time, right? It's going to be integrating all these measures, whether it be physiological or behavioral or patient-reported outcomes, and building contextually rich data sets to really, evaluate the state of the person. And to make appropriate, whether it be treatment decisions or, interpretation decisions on data, those sorts of things. I really think that's where we're moving. But I'll just sort of round that out by saying we can't have this innovation without integration, right? It's all about how do we work together? How do things interoperate, both from a tech standpoint, but also a researcher and clinical workflow standpoint.
Liam, any thoughts? I see your head nodding.
No, I just completely agree with that. I think the future is generally going to be multimodal. More and more of the companies that we work with are combining different modalities to better capture specific disease states. And so obviously, like, I'm pretty bullish about speech, but I think it's unlikely that speech is going to be like a primary endpoint for most neurological or psychiatric diseases. And I think where things are heading is, again, combining these different biomarkers. So whether it's activity patterns or facial expressions or eye movements or any of the other ones that we've talked about to better capture that person's state. That's what we're seeing with the companies that we're working with. And there are more companies out there that are combining these different biomarkers into a much more cohesive assessment.
So it sort of takes me back to my previous statements about Bayesians and pre-test, post-test, which is that we're all in medicine, we are always integrating we ought to always be integrating multimodal data for any diagnostic assessment. And I wonder, and again, this is sort of somewhat the edge of the field right now, but as folks think about these multimodal assessments, are they thinking about them as a series of pre-test, post-test probabilities, or are they trying to do magic?
So let's take the example of the system that does all this best, which is the human brain, right? And the human brain has a problem. It has Josh's problem of what do we do with energy? So your brain, all of our brains run on 25 watts. 15 of that, 12 to 13 of that watts is actually committed to maintaining the ability to be responsive, which means you got 13 watts to have this conversation. 13 watts. Okay. I've worked a lot with friends at IBM, and I used to say to them, "Oh, we've got Big Blue." I said, "Yeah, 300,000 watts. I'm going to give you 13 watts. How does your machine doing Jeopardy now?" And so 13 watts. So what has nature done? 13 watts. And by the way, how much data is coming in to everybody's brain? It's sort of restricted. We're just looking at a screen and just looking at auditory and looking at visual data. But even there, it's probably on the terabyte size in terms of the data which is pouring into your cortex at the present. Well, it's poured into your retina at the present time and your cochlea. Not what gets to your, it's not what gets to your area 17, or much less your area 7, which is integrating all this data. And then what we pay attention to is determined by our selective attention. And so how has nature solved the problem? This is what we're talking about. I've got a lot of data. What do I pay attention to? Where do I put the fidelity? Remember that your eyes and your ears actually turn up their fidelity when you pay attention to them. So you hear me because you hear what I'm saying, because you know that what I'm about to say next, which I can measure, by the way, with your N400, because your incongruity of your ability to tune your cochlea to what I'm likely to say next depends on your ability to predict what I'm about to say next. Dan's Bayesian. The brain does all this. We are now trying to build a brain with no constraint. Oh, hey, I can use as many watts as I want. And I would say what we all ought to do is say, can you do it in 13 watts, and can you do it in real time? Because the only thing I'm going to give you to integrate this is the binding problem in neuroscience. I'm going to give you 500 milliseconds. That's it, because that's what your brain gets. We're all, what I just said, I said 500 milliseconds ago, but you guys just heard it. Forget the delay of the internet. But your brain just perceived it just half a second after I did it, because that's the time it takes to solve it. If we understood the brain better, we'd actually know where the world's going, because the brain has been doing digital measurements, and the brain has been doing integrations and making decisions. And the nervous system, nature's had 500 million years to figure it out. We would do a lot better to steal from nature, because most of these problems have been solved to some degree. We at least give us a finite set of constraints to solve our equations. I just want to say we should be humble here. The shark has not changed for 435 million years. And it's able to do all this stuff.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to leave that at that. Thank you all so much for such a great panel discussion. I knew this would be a fun ending panel, and you guys did not disappoint. I want to thank you all for all of your time and effort, and I hope everyone out in the audience enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Thank you all for your comments, and I think this brings us to a close for the digital biomarkers and digital session that we're doing, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I guess I get a couple minutes at the end to add a few closing remarks. And I just wanted to say what a great conference this has been. I've enjoyed learning a great deal. I think it's demonstrated even over the years that I've been involved in digital, we've really starting to move the needle. We're seeing things progress. We're seeing advances. We're now no longer looking at single modalities. We're starting to look at multimodalities. We're starting to see how things interact. We're understanding that the question and the patient are truly important in what we're doing. And we're looking at it from all different viewpoints. It's become a very interesting field of interactions between scientists, clinicians, industry, pharma, all of it coming together to really start to explore this aspect. And I think if anything, this last session just really highlighted we still have a long ways to go. And there's a lot of interesting thoughts and questions that are still out there to be done. So thank you all for sticking with us throughout. I know I've used all of my time. I have 30 seconds left. I appreciate you, and I look forward to speaking with you, hopefully in person at the next meeting that we have, and are able to converse and have those nice social interactions to feed the brain and fulfill more than just my ear and retinas, as was just stated. So again, thank you. Have a great day, and look forward to seeing you at the next conference.